bury me quickly. So he passed this past Monday at 1:50 a.m. And here we are on Friday, burying him today. So that is what he wanted. The other thing he wanted, he didn't want a long Tongan traditional funeral. That's not what he wanted. He said, look, don't wear any Tongan stuff. You want to go in shorts, go in shorts. All right? Now, I appreciate about that my father, because I think that's the way he raised me, and it enabled me to become who I became, because he opened the doors to not be limited by a certain tradition. Not that traditions are bad, but I love that about him. Also, the other thing, he said, do the service at the cemetery. Once my body leaves here, do everything at the cemetery. I don't want to go anywhere. Don't take me to some other places. Do everything there. So that's what we're trying to honor. My memory of my dad, I know my nephew Josh had one. When I was in elementary school, my dad and I were driving. We were going to Fowa's house. They used to live right across the street from Southland Mall. And, I think people already said my dad does not talk very much. So I'm sitting in the car, and he says, "Stupid Tongans." So I turned to him, because I'm thinking he's talking to me. Right? I said, "Pop, what did you say?" And then he doesn't say anything, and then he looks at me and he says, "Stupid Tongans." Right? I had no idea what he said. He doesn't say anything, keeps driving, and then he says to me, "When people pay you to do a job, do not take advantage of them. Do the job." And then he kept driving. Now, it took me a long time to figure out what that meant, but I figured it out eventually. That's the kind of guy my father was. I have a scripture, Ecclesiastes 7:14. It says, "When life is good, enjoy it. But when life is hard, remember that God gives the good times and hard times. And no one knows what will happen in the future." A week ago Friday, my dad went into hospice. My wife, Messer, my sister, and my mom, we all met with the hospice nurse, talked to the doctors to make sure that he would pass and not have a lot of pain. And so our whole Friday, from 8:30 in the morning until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we're getting my dad set up, because we knew he was going to pass. And I know a lot of us here have experienced that, where you start saying prayers that you want your family to pass without pain. And so for me, that was a new one for me, right? That was a new prayer. So that was half of Friday. And then after we left there, both my wife and I, a lot of tears. And then we drive to Santa Clara University, where my son is about to graduate. He had a project that he had to do. So we drove and to watch his project, his senior project before graduation. And I told my wife on driving home, I said, it is amazing that in a 24-hour span, we both experienced two drastic parts of life. One that's ending and one that's just beginning. That scripture says when times are good in our life, we should enjoy it. But hard times are going to be there, and we have to manage both. It's not even a negative thing that my dad is passing. He's 84, and he's lived a great life. My dad started declining in January of this year. I probably went to the hospital more times from January to now and seen doctors. And I've talked to more doctors in the last 5 months than I've done my whole entire life. We're sitting in the car. Again, my dad doesn't talk very much. We're sitting in the hospital room. And then he turns to me and he said, "Hey, my dad died." This is him. "My dad died when he was 80. I said, "Really?" I said, "I thought he was 90 years old." He was 80. And then he said, "Fo'ua, he didn't reach 80. And then he said, Hoko didn't reach 80. And then he said, Lobeti didn't reach 80. Sione didn't reach 80. He said they all passed before they hit 80. And then he said, I'm 84. He goes, I think it's time for me to go. And then I told my dad, I said, no. I said, I think we got one more thing to do before you go. And then he looks at me, again, we're in the hospital. And then I said to him, he goes, what are you talking about? I said, we got one more thing. I said, you and I should talk about making it to heaven. Let's make sure that we're going to head in that path. Now, I'm not going to tell you the rest of the conversation, but I love the fact that my dad and I were able to sit there and have honest conversations before he passed. That's what I love the most. You know, another thing I wanted to just share real quick is you know, I got two pieces of advice that helped me during this whole time. One from my friend Sam, whose mom passed away, and one from my wife Messer. Sam told me when his mom was passing away that it was a hard time, but it was the best time because he was able to connect with his mom. My wife told me, she said, it is a blessing to you and your family that your dad did not pass away. My wife, her dad was a lawyer for the government, and he died when she was 6 because the plane that he was on crashed. The plane crashed. And she said, my dad died, it was so abrupt, we couldn't talk to him, we couldn't say bye. Well, we had so many questions and unanswered questions. She said, it is a blessing that you and your family get to go see your dad and express to him all that you love, appreciate. That was an amazing thing. I really loved that. You know, the other thing I would say is, let me make sure I got this. Okay. Last thing. Again, in the hospital, remember, the best conversations I've had with my father. I'm sitting in the hospital, then he says to me, hey, you know, I don't know if you know this, but he said a lot of Tongan men, when they get married in Tonga, they leave their wives and their kids and they go to the States or other places and they remarry. And I said, man, I didn't know that. He said, it's big in our culture. And I said, okay. And then I sat there and he wanted to tell me that. So I said to him, I said, now I remember you going to other places. I said, didn't you go to Hawaii? Did you go to New Zealand? Did you go to Australia? I said, I appreciate everybody else, but how about you? This is all while we're in the hospital. I appreciate my dad because my dad said to me, he said, you know, I've done a lot of stuff that I regret. And I said, what made you want to come back home? He said, you guys. He said, I wanted to be there with you guys. And then we talked. I said, hey, you know, I know you married mom, you know, single mom. And I said, this is during a time where I don't think in our culture that it was an accepted thing that you married a single mom. And he said to me, he said, you know, I said, did your parents, did your parents, grandpa and grandpa, did they want you to marry? He said, no. I said, why did you do it? He said, because I do what I want. I'm 53 years old. My dad died at 84. In the last 5 months, I have learned more things about him and his life and his choices than I've ever known. And I love the fact that he answered every single question. All while we're in the hospital. My last thing in the hospital, I said to him, I said, man, why did you do some of the stuff? You know what he said to me? He said, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. He says, those are things that I want to make sure I tell you. And I love the fact that me and him, I don't have a lot, I feel sad because he's not here, but I love the fact that I was able to answer, to express all that I felt and all that I thought, and had him talk to me openly and honestly, and we didn't have to play games and pretend that everything was okay. You know, there's a Frank Sinatra song I'm going to close out with, and I think it describes my father's perspective about life, and it's called My Way. And it says, and now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain. My friend, I'll say it clear. I'll state my case, of which I'm certain. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway, and much more than this, I did it my way. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exemption. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and much more than this, I did it my way. I've loved, I've laughed, I've cried, I've had my fill, my share of loving, and now its tears subside. I find it all so amazing to think I did all that in mine. And may I say, not in a shy way, oh no, not me, I did it my way. For what is the man, what has he got, if not himself, then he was not, to say the things he truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels. The record shows I took the blows, and I did it my way. Yes, It was my way. Thank you so much for coming here and being able to honor my father.